Do you like Hisuian Goodra? I like Hisuian Goodra, and I like to sculpt things, so I decided to make a Hisuian Goodra figure. Okay, that's the intro. You know why you clicked on this video. Let's begin! As always, I made a small drawing to have as a reference for the proportions and all that, and once that was done, I started to work on this shell, which is pretty fucking fat and big, so I used a good amount of clay to make it. The first step was to make this big fat worm with one end considerably wider than the other, similar to the shape of a chicken leg, because, well, looking at some photos we can see that the shell is thicker at the top. Then I started to roll it into the shape I wanted. Here, as in many occasions, what you're watching is not the first attempt. This was actually the fourth attempt. The others ended up looking kind of flat at the top, which wasn't accurate. At this point, the spiral wasn't looking very good, especially in the middle part. However, I decided that working on those details later would be easier once the shell dried, and that was the problem I was facing now. If you already have some experience with this type of clay, you probably know that pieces as large as these take a long time to dry, and the worst thing is that while it was drying, I couldn't leave it on a table or another surface like that because it would be crushed under its own weight. So let's say that I panicked a bit while I was looking for a place to leave it. In the end, I used the classic L-shaped wire technique and left it hanging. Then I made the body, which was a fairly simple shape to make, with a long and thin neck and a completely flat ass that would connect to the shell. Since it was a somewhat dense piece, I also put a wire on it and left it hanging. Another thing I made at this point was this flat piece. This would become the core for the base, which I also left drying. We will come back to this later. After several days, I removed the wires from the shell, and here I overestimated the drying capability of the clay because it was still fresh in the center, plus it was fucking heavy. So I decided to remove some of the inner clay and replace it with aluminum foil. For this, I made a hole in the front part, and then with a finger I massaged the inside of the shell to start loosening all that clay. I also used this tool to remove what was further inside. Then I made a ball of aluminum foil and tried to put it into the shell, but it was too big for that hole, that's what she said, so I decided to divide it into smaller pieces, and gradually I filled the shell just like a Christmas turkey. Then I put this piece back, and with clay and water I blended all the seams that had been left. Finally, I worked on the look of the spiral with more clay and water. That tool you see there was pretty important to properly define the details. For the legs, I made a couple of little balls which I pinched little by little until I got the shape that I wanted. Here the most difficult thing was that both ended up being the same size. Taking advantage of the fact that they were still fresh, I decided to glue them onto the body. So I took it down, removed the wires and glued them. For the arms, I made a couple of small worms, with one end a little wider than the other, and around the middle I made a small bend and glued them onto the body. Later on I made the head, starting from a little ball which I began to pinch on one side to get the nose and the mouth. I put a wire in the neck and glued it to the rest of the body, making it look a little bit to one side so that it wouldn't look too rigid. And yeah, the pose for this figure is that it's looking slightly to one side, shut up. And then it was time to blend all the seams with fresh clay and water. Then I put the slime that hangs below its head and arms. And finally, with the help of a wire, some glue and a little bit of clay, it was time to attach the body and the shell. As a small reinforcement, I put a little bit of glue in that part there, and once it was completely dry, I covered that line. Then I made the antennae, which are not just simple little worms, they have a very specific shape. They have a wide base, then a very thin center, and a little ball at the end. And after they dried a little, I stuck them in place. Later I made the smaller antennae, this, blended all the seams, and it was time to paint. The painting was easy. In fact, it was so easy that now we can move on to the base. So, I grabbed this chunk that by now was dry and dropped it in a thick layer of clay mixed with yellow and brown paint. I flattened it on the bottom, and on the top I gave it some texture with sandpaper. When it dried, I put green clay on top of it to make some grass. I already mentioned this in the Arcanine video, go check it out. But a technique that I like to use for making grass is to grab some pointed object or tool and make circular movements on the surface. I recommend to keep the clay slightly wet so that the texture comes out better. Lastly, with the help of a couple of wires and super glue, I attached the figure onto the base. And that's it! If you liked this figure and this video, please leave a like and subscribe and all those things. A rather simple figure for this week. Really, the most challenging part was to make the shell. The body and the painting were not that hard. But yeah, I like it, it was fun. I really enjoyed this new version of Goodra. I think it's just really fun. Okay, that's it. Bye!